What would you do if the place you trusted to build your future became the source of unimaginable betrayal? For 19-year-old Private Mia Thompson, a single moment shattered her world, unraveling a chilling scandal that would rock an entire military base. Stay tuned as we uncover the hidden truths, the unspoken abuses, and the shocking events behind one of the most controversial stories in military history. Private Mia Thompson had spent her entire life in the small town of Winter Haven, Florida, where every road seemed to lead back to the same place. Raised by her mother, a dedicated nurse, Mia grew up in the shadow of her late father's legacy, a decorated Army veteran who had died when she was just a child. His medals and neatly folded flag were displayed in the family's modest living room, constant reminders of a life dedicated to service. For as long as Mia could remember, she dreamed of following in his footsteps, craving the discipline, purpose, and honor that the military seemed to offer. At 19, she was ready to escape the confines of small-town life. The Army was her way out, her chance to build something meaningful and prove to herself, and to the memory of her father, that she could achieve greatness. With her mother's bittersweet blessing, Mia boarded the bus to begin her journey at the sprawling military base near Jacksonville, Florida. The base was nothing like she'd imagined. As the bus pulled through the gates, Mia was greeted by the sight of towering fences, rows of utilitarian barracks, and the constant hum of activity. Soldiers marched in formation across sun-scorched fields, their boots kicking up dust under the sharp commands of drill sergeants. Helicopters whirred overhead, and trucks rumbled through the grounds in an unending stream of movement. Mia stepped off the bus with her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and apprehension. She was one of the youngest recruits and one of the few women in her unit, a fact that quickly became obvious. Her presence didn't go unnoticed. Some of the male recruits cast lingering glances, while others sized her up with skeptical smirks. The first few days were a whirlwind of activity, orientation sessions, medical checkups, and an endless series of drills. Mia quickly realized that the physical demands of training were only part of the challenge. The real test was navigating the unspoken dynamics of a male-dominated environment. Some of the men dismissed her as weak, while others seemed eager to remind her of her place through snide remarks or subtle intimidation. But Mia wasn't about to let anyone see her falter. She pushed herself harder than she ever had before, determined to prove she belonged. Every lap around the field, every grueling obstacle course, and every shouted order was met with grit and quiet determination. Slowly, she began to earn the respect of some of her peers, but the weight of being constantly scrutinized never fully lifted. Among the officers at the base, Captain Harris was a name that carried weight. Known for his sharp wit and commanding presence, he had a reputation for being both an effective leader and a man who could charm just about anyone. To the recruits, Harris was a figure of authority and admiration, someone to emulate and fear in equal measure. Mia first caught Harris's attention during a morning drill. She was completing a timed obstacle course under the unrelenting Florida sun, sweat dripping down her face as she climbed over a towering wall. Harris stood at the edge of the field, clipboard in hand, watching the recruits with a calculating gaze. When Mia finished the course, gasping for breath but determined to keep her composure, he approached her. "You've got potential, Thompson," he said, his voice steady but unusually warm. "I can see you're not here to mess around." His words caught Mia off guard. Most of the officers barely acknowledged her existence, let alone offered encouragement. Over the next few weeks, Harris continued to take notice of her during drills and exercises. He corrected her form during runs, offered tips on improving her performance, and even stopped by her barracks once to check on her progress. At first, Mia felt flattered. Harris seemed genuinely invested in her success, and his attention made her feel seen in a way she hadn't since arriving at the base. But over time, his behavior began to shift. Harris started asking personal questions about her family, her hometown, and why she joined the Army. His compliments, initially professional, became more intimate. "You're not like the others," he told her one afternoon during a weapons training session. "You've got heart. That's rare in a place like this." Mia tried to convince herself that Harris's interest was harmless, even supportive. But his tone, his lingering glances, and the way he always seemed to find opportunities to be alone with her made her stomach knot with unease. One evening, during a late-night drill, Harris called Mia aside under the pretense of offering guidance. The training field was dark, lit only by scattered floodlights. As the other recruits jogged laps in the distance, Harris stood uncomfortably close, his voice low and steady as he spoke. "You've got real potential, Thompson," he said, his hand brushing against her shoulder. "But you've got to learn to trust me if you want to make it here." Mia nodded stiffly, her heart pounding in her chest. That night, as she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that her mentor's interest in her wasn't as innocent as it seemed. For the first time, the base, her escape from a small-town life, began to feel like a trap. The humid Florida night carried the weight of exhaustion as Mia Thompson pushed herself through the last lap of the late-night training drill. Sweat dripped from her face, and her muscles burned, but she held her pace. The harsh glare of the floodlights cast long shadows across the field as her fellow recruits jogged toward the barracks. Just as the drill sergeant blew the whistle to dismiss them, Captain Harris's sharp voice cut through the air. "Thompson, a word," he said, motioning for her to follow him. Mia hesitated, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by unease. Harris was her superior, and refusing wasn't an option. She followed him toward an isolated storage building on the edge of the training grounds, its corrugated metal walls reflecting the dim glow of the distant lights. The door creaked as he pushed it open and gestured for her to step inside. The air inside was stifling, thick with the faint smell of oil and dust. Harris closed the door behind them, his tall frame blocking her only exit. At first, his tone was calm, almost encouraging, as he began to critique her performance during the drill. He stepped closer, his words shifting from professional advice to something more personal. "You've got potential, Thompson," he said, his voice low. "But you need to learn to trust your superiors. That's how you'll make it here." The shift was subtle but unmistakable. His gaze lingered too long, and his proximity felt invasive. Mia's instinct was to step back, but the wall of shelves behind her left nowhere to go. Harris's demeanor grew more intense, his words tinged with an unsettling familiarity. Before Mia could react, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Relax," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "You're overthinking everything." Her breath caught in her throat as his hand moved to her shoulder, then lower. Panic surged through her, but she froze, her mind racing with fear and disbelief. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but the weight of his authority pinned her in place. Harris leaned in, his grip firm but calculated, ensuring she couldn't easily escape. "This stays between us," he murmured, his tone leaving no room for argument. The assault was brief but shattering. By the time he stepped back, adjusting his uniform as if nothing had happened, Mia felt hollow. She stood frozen, her body trembling, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Harris's demeanor returned to its usual polished charm, as though he'd done nothing more than deliver routine feedback. "You're dismissed, Private," he said, his voice cold and indifferent. Mia stumbled out of the storage building, her legs weak and her chest tight. The darkness of the training field felt suffocating as she made her way back to the barracks, tears threatening to spill, but held back by sheer will. Inside her bunk, she sat silently, staring at the wall, replaying the encounter over and over. Her mind wrestled with the impossibility of reporting what had happened. Harris was a respected officer, someone her peers admired. Who would believe her? She'd heard the stories, how women who spoke out were labeled troublemakers, their careers ruined while their abusers went unscathed. She knew the culture on the base. It silenced victims and protected predators. Mia buried her face in her hands, the humiliation and fear overwhelming her. That night, sleep eluded her, the echoes of Harris's voice and the feel of his hands leaving scars that would not fade. The place she had once seen as her sanctuary now felt like a prison, and for the first time she wondered if she'd ever truly escape. Weeks passed and Mia's body began to betray her. Fatigue gripped her like a vice, and she struggled to keep pace during drills. Headaches became constant companions, and her normally hearty appetite disappeared. Initially, she chalked it up to the relentless demands of training, But when she started experiencing fever-like symptoms, she knew something was wrong. At the base clinic, the medic on duty took her vitals and ordered routine blood work. Mia waited for days, anxiety gnawing at her as her condition worsened. Finally, the doctor called her into his office, his face grim as he gestured for her to sit. "We've received your results, Private Thompson," he began, his voice heavy with hesitation. "I'm afraid we've found something unexpected." Mia's world seemed to tilt as the words left his mouth. "You're HIV positive." The room felt impossibly small. Her ears rang as the doctor's voice faded into a blur of medical jargon. HIV positive. The words echoed in her mind, growing louder with each repetition. She stared at the test results he handed her, the clinical terms and numbers blurring together. "This can't be right," she whispered, her voice breaking. "There has to be a mistake." "I'm sorry, Thompson," the doctor said softly, but his sympathy felt hollow. Mia barely had time to process the shock before the doctor's tone shifted. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear. "You can't let this get out," he said firmly. "If this goes on your record, you'll be discharged immediately. HIV disqualifies you from active duty." Mia blinked, unsure she'd heard him correctly. "We'll handle this discreetly," he continued. "I'll prescribe antiretroviral medication, but I'll list it as a supplement in your file. No one else needs to know." The weight of his words sank in. This wasn't about her well-being. It was about containment, about keeping the base's image intact. In the days that followed, Mia began to piece together the full extent of the cover-up. She overheard fragments of conversations in the clinic, murmurs about other soldiers who had been quietly discharged under similar circumstances. Through whispers and anonymous tips, she uncovered Harris's dark history. He had preyed on recruits before, his position shielding him from consequences. At least 2 female soldiers had been sent home with medical discharges after being diagnosed with sexually transmitted infections. Mia's shock gave way to rage. Harris wasn't just a predator, he was a serial abuser, and the system had protected him at every turn. Worse, the institution she had trusted to uphold honor and discipline was complicit in sweeping his actions under the rug. Mia's humiliation burned into a cold, simmering fury. The betrayal was complete, not just by Harris but by the military itself. They had failed her, just as they had failed countless others. She decided she wouldn't stay silent any longer, but Mia's plan wasn't to report Harris. She knew the system too well to expect justice from within. Instead, she began plotting her revenge. Harris wouldn't just face the consequences of his actions, he and others like him would feel the full weight of her wrath. Her resolve solidified as she sat in her barracks late at night, staring at the empty notebook in front of her. Slowly, methodically, she began to write down names. Harris was first, but he wouldn't be the last. For the first time since her diagnosis, Mia felt a glimmer of control, and she vowed to take back the power that had been stolen from her. If you've made it this far, comment "soldier" to show your solidarity with those who confront injustice. Yet Harris wasn't the only one. Whispers and observations during her time on the base had revealed a pattern, a culture where power was abused without consequence. Harris was one of many, and Mia's resolve sharpened as she realized that her revenge would not stop with him. Over the following days, Mia's focus shifted. Her despair transformed into a grim determination as she began to identify her targets. She listened carefully during drills and casual conversations, picking up on the rumors and patterns she'd once ignored. There was Lieutenant Reed, whose flirtatious comments with younger recruits often crossed the line. Sergeant Harper, a married man with a reputation for using his authority to intimidate subordinates into private meetings. Major Daniels, known for mentoring female recruits but often with ulterior motives. And Colonel Briggs, a man whose influence protected those beneath him, enabling their misconduct. Each name carried its own weight of arrogance and exploitation. Mia didn't act impulsively. She began by observing their routines, when they were most vulnerable, their habits, and the places where they let their guards down. She scribbled meticulous notes in her journal, documenting everything: the times Lieutenant Reed lingered in the mess hall, the secluded areas where Harper often cornered recruits, the false kindness Major Daniels used to gain trust, and the moments Briggs seemed most preoccupied with maintaining his image. Each note added clarity to her plan. She wasn't reckless. This had to be precise. If she acted carelessly, she risked being caught or dismissed. Her success depended on making each encounter appear voluntary, ensuring no one suspected her intentions. Mia knew that the very traits her targets had exploited, her youth, her appearance, and her perceived vulnerability, could now become her weapons. She began to approach them subtly, crafting scenarios where they believed they held the power. Mia's plan began with Captain Harris, the man who started it all. She approached him one evening after a grueling drill, feigning exhaustion and vulnerability. "I don't think I'm cut out for this," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Harris, sensing an opportunity to exert his power once again, softened his tone, offering words of encouragement that felt more calculated than genuine. She allowed him to lead her to a quiet, secluded area under the pretense of offering advice. There, Mia pretended to seek comfort, leaning into his touch just enough to make him believe he was in control. By the end of the encounter, Harris had unwittingly fallen into her trap, completely unaware of the consequences awaiting him. Lieutenant Reed was next. Arrogant and self-assured, he had always prided himself on being a mentor to young recruits. Mia played into his delusions, approaching him with questions about advancing her career. During one-on-one sessions in the empty officers' lounge, she let her admiration for his leadership seep into the conversation, her carefully calculated compliments stroking his ego. Reed, emboldened by her apparent interest, began steering their discussions toward personal topics. One evening, Mia accidentally brushed her hand against his as she reached for a document. The moment lingered just long enough to shift the tone between them, and before the night was over, Reed had taken the bait. Major Daniels was more guarded, his authority tempered by a reputation for professionalism. Mia knew his weak spot, his ego. She requested a private meeting under the guise of seeking advice on navigating the base's chain of command. Daniels, flattered by her deference, agreed. During their conversation, Mia leaned into her role, expressing gratitude for his wisdom and guidance. The careful mix of respect and subtle flirtation wore down his defenses. When she innocently touched his arm while thanking him, Daniels hesitated but didn't pull away. The interaction, seemingly harmless, quickly escalated, and Mia ensured he, too, unknowingly exposed himself to her condition. Sergeant Harper proved the easiest to manipulate. His reputation as a married man with a wandering eye preceded him, and Mia used it to her advantage. She pretended to confide in him, sharing fabricated struggles about feeling isolated as a young woman on the base. Harper, ever eager to play the role of a sympathetic confidant, invited her to a private conversation in his office. Mia carefully balanced vulnerability with subtle charm, allowing Harper's guilt to erode what little restraint he had. It didn't take long for him to cross the line, leaving Mia both disgusted and triumphant. Colonel Briggs was the most challenging target. His experience made him cautious, and his reputation as a fatherly figure to recruits gave him an air of untouchability. Mia approached him with calculated respect, seeking his guidance during drills and meetings. Over time, she built a rapport, carefully crafting an image of trust and dependence. Briggs, lulled by her apparent sincerity, eventually agreed to a private conversation to discuss her future. Mia executed her plan flawlessly, ensuring even the most guarded of her targets fell victim to her scheme. Each step of Mia's plan brought her closer to the justice she sought, but the cost weighed heavily on her. The satisfaction of watching her targets fall was fleeting, replaced by a growing darkness she couldn't ignore. Her revenge was almost complete, but the fallout was just beginning. If you've made it this far, comment "Soldier" to show your solidarity with those who confront injustice. Harris was the first to fall ill, his absence from morning drills sparking quiet speculation among the recruits. Within weeks, Lieutenant Reed reported similar symptoms, followed closely by Sergeant Harper, Major Daniels, and finally Colonel Briggs. Each man visited the base clinic, their symptoms eerily alike: fatigue, fever, and weight loss. The diagnoses came swiftly. They were HIV positive. The news, though confined to hushed conversations among medical staff, couldn't stay hidden for long. Rumors swept through the base like wildfire, leaving soldiers and officers alike on edge. The idea of an outbreak within their ranks created an atmosphere of unease, and questions began to arise. How could 5 high-ranking officers contract the same condition? Theories ranged from chance encounters to a deliberate act of sabotage, but the truth remained just out of reach. Behind closed doors, military investigators were already piecing together the puzzle. Harris's condition, once considered an isolated case, now appeared connected to the others. It didn't take long for investigators to uncover a thread linking the 5 men, their interactions with Private Mia Thompson. She had flown under the radar as a quiet and determined recruit, but her proximity to each of the officers now drew scrutiny. The investigators combed through her records and activity, uncovering damning evidence that tied her to the unfolding scandal. Online logs revealed cryptic searches about HIV transmission, while interviews with recruits painted a picture of a soldier who had grown increasingly detached in recent months. The final blow came when surveillance footage and messages from the officers themselves confirmed private meetings with Mia. One humid morning, the base erupted in chaos. Military police stormed the barracks, their boots thundering against the concrete floor as they approached Mia's bunk. She was calm when they arrived, as though she had been expecting them. Without a word, she stood and allowed them to handcuff her, her expression unreadable as they led her past rows of stunned recruits. Whispers followed her down the hallway, disbelief etched on the faces of her peers. Mia was taken to a stark interrogation room, the walls bare and the air heavy with tension. For hours, the investigators pressed her, their questions sharp and relentless. At first, she offered only silence, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. But when they presented the evidence, her internet searches, the messages from the officers, and the timeline of events, Mia finally spoke. She confessed everything. Her voice was steady as she recounted the assault by Captain Harris, the cover-up of her diagnosis, and the system that had protected predators while discarding their victims. She detailed her anger, her despair, and the decision to take control in the only way she felt she could. "I didn't just want revenge," she said quietly, her tone laced with bitterness. "I wanted them to feel what I felt, to know what it's like to lose everything." Her confession left the room in silence, the weight of her words lingering long after the investigators departed. Mia had exposed not just her actions, but the dark underbelly of a system built on power and silence. The fallout had only just begun. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air charged with a mix of curiosity and outrage. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised to capture every moment of what had become one of the most shocking scandals in military history. Mia Thompson, dressed in a crisp uniform and flanked by guards, sat quietly at the defendant's table. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had already endured far more than most could imagine. The trial became a media sensation, with every detail of Mia's actions and the officer's downfall dissected in headlines and television specials. As her testimony unfolded, the world watched in stunned silence. Mia recounted the abuse she suffered at the hands of Captain Harris, the cover-up that followed, and the systemic culture that protected predators while silencing victims. Her words were raw, exposing a toxic environment that the military had long worked to keep hidden. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw Mia as a victim, a young woman driven to desperation by betrayal and systemic failures. They praised her courage in exposing the truth, even as they struggled to reconcile her actions with her motives. Others, however, condemned her as a criminal, arguing that her calculated revenge had endangered lives and tarnished the reputation of the armed forces. The officers she targeted were not spared the fallout. Testimonies from other recruits and leaked documents revealed a pattern of misconduct that extended far beyond Mia's case. Captain Harris was court-martialed, his history of preying on recruits laid bare for all to see. Lieutenant Reed and Sergeant Harper, whose indiscretions had long been whispered about, faced public disgrace and swift resignations. Major Daniels and Colonel Briggs, once seen as pillars of the base, found their reputations shattered. The military faced widespread criticism, with calls for reform echoing from advocacy groups and politicians alike. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was silent. Mia was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in military prison. There were no outbursts, no protests, just a heavy finality that settled over the room. Though condemned for her actions, Mia felt a small measure of solace. The truth had been exposed, and the stories of others like her would no longer remain buried. As she was led away, Mia knew her life would never be the same, but for the first time she felt the stirrings of peace. In the sterile confines of her prison cell, Mia Thompson found herself confronting the full weight of her actions. Stripped of the chaos and anger that had driven her, she was left with only her thoughts and a gnawing sense of guilt. Slowly, she began to take accountability, not just for the harm she had caused, but for the lives she had irrevocably changed. Recognizing the opportunity to turn her pain into purpose, Mia joined an HIV awareness program within the prison, sharing her story with fellow inmates. Her candor and vulnerability inspired others, fostering a sense of solidarity and education around the stigma of HIV. Mia's reflections became the foundation of a memoir, a raw and unflinching account of her experiences. In it, she detailed the systemic failures that had allowed abuse to thrive in the military, the personal toll of betrayal, and the consequences of her vengeance. The book became a national bestseller, sparking a powerful conversation about power dynamics, victim silencing, and the urgent need for reform. In response to the scandal, the military introduced sweeping changes. New policies focused on preventing harassment, protecting whistleblowers, and ensuring accountability for misconduct. Mia's story became a case study for change, a cautionary tale that highlighted the dangers of unchecked power and the necessity of systemic reform. While Mia could never undo the pain she caused, she found purpose in advocating for justice and healing. Her voice, once silenced, became a powerful tool for change, proving that even in the darkest moments, redemption is possible. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Your support helps us bring these stories to light.